I wrote another song about him called I Believe, which was on an album in 1992, and it was, and every now and again, he turns up in songs, you know, for no other reason than I miss him a lot.
As the golden god of Led Zeppelin, Robert Plant commanded the world from the stage, a symbol of rock and roll excess. But fame offered no defense against reality. Offstage, a relentless chain of tragedy, a crippling accident, the sudden death of his 5-year-old son, and the loss of his closest friend would shatter his world completely. This is not the story of a rock star's glory, but of how profound personal loss dismantled the myth and forged the man who was left behind. In the vast and often mythologized history of rock and roll, few figures loom as large or as luminous as Robert Plant. Born on the 20th of August, 1948, the man who would become the definitive voice and image of Led Zeppelin was, by 2026, a figure of enduring legacy at the age of 77. As the frontman for the monumental band he co-founded in 1968, Plant was far more than a singer. He was an archetype, dubbed the Golden God for his cascading mane of blonde hair and his Adonis-like physique. He commanded stages with a raw, untamed energy that was both primal and poetic. His vocal instrument was a force of nature, a dynamic 4-octave range that could shift from a tender, blues-inflected whisper to a full-throated, banshee wail that would define the very sound of hard rock and heavy metal for generations to come. The success of Led Zeppelin was not just immense, it was earth-shattering. The band sold tens of millions of albums, with conservative estimates placing their worldwide sales between 200 and 300 million units, making them one of the best-selling musical artists in history. Their tours were legendary, breaking box office records previously set by the Beatles and creating a mystique of power and excess that was unparalleled. However, the brilliant, blinding light of the stage cast a long and profound shadow behind the larger-than-life persona and the lyrics steeped in mythology and fantasy. A series of devastating personal tragedies unfolded, one after another, with relentless cruelty. These events would systematically dismantle the rock star image, forcing a deep and permanent transformation upon the man at the center of the storm. The untamed golden god would slowly recede, replaced by a quiet, introspective individual who turned his back on the excesses of his youth to seek solace and anonymity in the gentle, rolling hills of his native Worcestershire. This is not simply a story of a rock star who grew older. It is the chronicle of how profound personal pain can reshape a life more completely than any amount of fame or fortune. Robert Plant's journey is a stark and powerful testament to a fundamental truth: that the immense success of a musical career provides no sanctuary from the depths of human sorrow. And that, for him, the crucible of tragedy ultimately proved to be a more formative force than the blaze of glory. The illusion of rock and roll invincibility, an aura that surrounded Led Zeppelin at the zenith of their power, was first violently punctured on the 4th of August, 1975. The band was on a brief hiatus, enjoying a well-earned rest after a triumphant 5-night stand at London's Earl's Court, and before embarking on what was planned to be a colossal North American tour. Robert Plant, his wife Maureen, and their 2 young children, 4-year-old Carmen and 5-year-old Karak, were vacationing on the picturesque Greek island of Rhodes, while driving a rented Austin Mini on a narrow road. The vehicle veered off the pavement and collided with a tree with devastating force. While some reports suggest Maureen was at the wheel, others indicate it was Plant, but the catastrophic outcome remained the same. The immediate aftermath was a scene of chaos and severe injury. Plant himself suffered a shattered ankle and a fractured elbow, injuries that were complex and debilitating. His wife, Maureen, bore the brunt of the impact, sustaining a fractured skull, a broken pelvis, and a compound fracture to her leg. She lost a significant amount of blood and was in critical condition, her life hanging in the balance. In a small mercy, the children, who were in the back of the car, escaped with less severe injuries. Carmen suffered a broken wrist, while Karak sustained a broken leg. The family was initially taken to a local hospital where the conditions were reportedly primitive, prompting the band's manager, Peter Grant, to arrange for a private jet to airlift them back to London for proper medical attention. The long-term consequences of the crash were extensive and life-altering. Plant's recovery was a grueling ordeal that stretched over the better part of 2 years. He spent many months confined to a wheelchair, a stark and humbling contrast to the dynamic, preening frontman who commanded stadiums. Doctors initially warned him that he might not walk properly again, a prognosis that plunged him into a period of deep depression and introspection. The physical pain was constant, but the psychological toll was just as significant. This period of forced immobility directly impacted the band's next creative phase. The recording sessions for their 1976 album, Presence, were conducted while Plant was still in his wheelchair. He sang his vocal parts from his seated position, channeling his pain, frustration, and anger into one of the band's most raw and intense records. Professionally, the crash was a disaster. The planned North American tour, a 33-date spectacle for which tickets had already been sold, was canceled in its entirety. This resulted in a massive financial loss, estimated to be in the millions of dollars, and brought the band's seemingly unstoppable momentum to a screeching halt. For Plant, personally, the accident was the first profound shock to his system. It was a brutal confrontation with his own mortality and the fragility of the life he had built. The image of the rockstar Bat-2, immortal rockstar, was irrevocably cracked. This traumatic event marked the beginning of a profound internal shift, forcing him to recognize the precariousness of existence that lay just beneath the surface of his fantastical public persona. 2 years after the Rhodes accident, just as life had begun to find a semblance of normalcy, tragedy struck Robert Plant again, this time with an unimaginable and soul-crushing force. It was July of 1977, and Led Zeppelin was once again conquering America. Embarked on a tour that represented the absolute peak of their commercial power and cultural influence. They were playing to record-breaking crowds in massive stadiums, the kings of a world they had created. On July 23rd, while in the French Quarter of New Orleans, preparing for a show at the Louisiana Superdome that was expected to draw over 76,000 people, Plant received a distressing phone call from his wife, Maureen. Their son, Karak, now 5 years old, had fallen ill. The initial diagnosis was a stomach virus, and, while concerning, it was not initially perceived as a life-or-death situation. The situation, however, escalated with terrifying speed. A second phone call came just 3 days later, on July 26, 1977. The news it carried was the most devastating a parent can receive. Karak's illness, diagnosed as a virulent stomach enteritis, had overwhelmed his small body, and he had passed away suddenly. Plant was 4,000 miles away from home, a helpless victim of geography and time. He was unable to get back to England in time to hold his son or say a final goodbye, reportedly missing his last moments by only a few hours. The world of the Golden God, a world of fantasy, power, and adoration, collapsed into a single point of unbearable pain. Plant's reaction was one of complete and utter breakdown. His bandmates and tour manager, Richard Cole, described him collapsing in grief, letting out a primal scream of anguish that was more raw and real than any sound he had ever produced on stage. The remaining 7 dates of the North American tour were immediately canceled, a decision that carried a financial cost of millions and disappointed hundreds of thousands of fans. but was an absolute necessity. For the next several days, Plant went into total seclusion, isolating himself from everyone. Consumed by a grief so profound, it threatened to extinguish his own creative fire. In the dark and empty days that followed, he seriously contemplated walking away from music forever. The artifice and excess of the rock and roll life now seemed utterly meaningless and obscene in the face of his loss. He sought a path toward something he considered more honest and wholesome, going so far as to apply for a teaching position at a local Rudolf Steiner school. It was a tangible step toward a new, quieter life, a life away from the stage and its painful reminders of a world where he had been an absent father when his son needed him most. It was during this period that the unwavering friendship of his bandmates, particularly drummer John Bonham, became his lifeline. Bonham refused to let Plant disappear into his sorrow. He would physically pull him out of his house, drive him to the pub, and simply sit with him, providing a comforting and steadfast presence that was instrumental in Plant's eventual decision to carry on. The emotional and creative legacy of Carrack's death would echo throughout the rest of Plant's life and career. He processed his grief through his art, most notably in the song All My Love, from the 1979 album In Through the Outdoor. The track was a radical departure for Led Zeppelin, a gentle, synthesizer-led ballad that stood in stark contrast to their usual bombast. It was a direct and heartfelt tribute to his son, a song so emotionally potent that it was reportedly recorded in a single take. As Plant could not bear the pain of singing the lyrics a second time, the loss permanently altered his perspective. The fantasy world he had once inhabited lost all its appeal, replaced by a deep-seated need for authenticity and a rejection of the empty excesses of his past. The death of Carrack was the single most defining event of Robert Plant's life. It was the tragedy that shattered the myth of the Golden God and revealed the vulnerable, grieving father who would have to learn to live with the pain for the rest of his days. As the 1970s drew to a close, Robert Plant and the other members of Led Zeppelin were tentatively looking toward the future. They had weathered the storm of Carrack's death and were in rehearsals for a new North American tour scheduled for the autumn of 1980, their first since the tragedy 3 years prior. It was meant to be a new beginning, a reassertion of their dominance. Instead, it would be the setting for the final, fatal blow to the band. On the 24th of September, 1980, the band gathered for rehearsals at guitarist Jimmy Page's home in Windsor. Throughout the day, drummer John Bonham engaged in extremely heavy drinking, a problem that had been escalating for some time, fueled by the pressures of fame and the band's long periods of inactivity. By the end of the evening, after reportedly consuming an astonishing 40 shots of vodka, an intoxicated Bonham was helped to bed by an assistant. The next afternoon, on September 25th, bassist John Paul Jones and the band's road manager went to wake him, only to find him unresponsive. John Bonham was dead at the age of 32. The official coroner's report concluded that he had died from asphyxiation after inhaling his own vomit in his sleep, ruling the death accidental for Robert Plant. This was a loss of devastating proportions. Bonham was not just his bandmate, he was his oldest and closest friend, a kindred spirit from their early days in the Midlands. More than that, Bonham had been his savior in the aftermath of Carrack's death. He was the one who had physically and emotionally pulled Plant from the depths of his grief, refusing to let him abandon his life and career. The loss of his son had been an unbearable sorrow, but the loss of Bonham was the loss of his anchor, the man who had helped him stay afloat. The death of their drummer was an event from which Led Zeppelin could not and would not recover. Bonham's powerful, inimitable style was the very heartbeat of their sound. He was considered utterly irreplaceable. To continue with another drummer was simply unthinkable. On the 4th of December, 1980, the surviving members issued a short, definitive statement to the press. "We wish it to be known that the loss of our dear friend and the deep respect we have for his family, together with the deep sense of undivided harmony felt by ourselves and our manager, have led us to decide that we could not continue as we were." This was not a hiatus. It was an unequivocal end. In the decades that followed, despite persistent rumors and astronomical financial offers, including one reported to be as high as $800 million for a reunion tour, the band steadfastly refused to reform in any permanent capacity. For Plant, the reason was deeply personal and non-negotiable. He felt that the magic and chemistry of the band had died with his friend. The death of John Bonham did not just mark the end of the world's biggest rock band, it represented the closing of a monumental chapter in Plant's life, leaving behind a void that could never be filled and sealing his retreat from the world of stadium rock he had once so completely dominated. The cumulative weight of the tragedies of the late 1970s created immense pressure that inevitably seeped into Robert Plant's home life, leading to further personal upheaval. In 1983, his marriage to Maureen Wilson, the woman who had been by his side since 1966, officially ended in divorce. Maureen had been a constant presence through every phase of his life, from the struggles of his pre-fame days to the dizzying heights of Led Zeppelin's success, and through the unimaginable shared trauma of the car accident in Rhodes and the death of their son. However, the immense strain of these events, coupled with the new pressures Plant faced as he embarked on a solo career in the wake of Led Zeppelin's dissolution, ultimately proved too much for the marriage to withstand. The partnership that had survived so much heartbreak could not survive its aftermath. The family structure would undergo further, more complex changes in the years to come. In 1991, it was revealed that Plant had fathered a son, named Jesse Lee, with Maureen's sister, Shirley Wilson. This was a deeply private family matter that became public knowledge, adding another layer of complexity to their intertwined lives. Despite the potentially difficult circumstances, the family appeared to navigate the situation with a quiet resilience. In later years, Maureen and Shirley were even seen attending Plant's concerts together, suggesting a form of reconciliation and an acceptance of their unique and unbreakable familial bond. Jesse Lee, for his part, has remained almost entirely out of the public eye, choosing a life of privacy away from the shadow of his father's fame. Plant's romantic life continued to be marked by significant, though less tragic, endings. From around 2010 to 2014, he was in a serious relationship with acclaimed American singer-songwriter Patty Griffin. Their partnership was both personal and professional. They lived together for a time in Austin, Texas, and collaborated musically in Plant's resurrected Band of Joy project. The relationship eventually ended, with Plant attributing the split in part to the cultural differences and the logistical challenges of their transatlantic lives. He expressed a deep sense of sadness over the breakup, acknowledging his profound and ultimately unbreakable connection to his English homeland and the community he had there. Some biographical sources also allude to the long-term effects of his accidents, mentioning that a second, less publicized car crash may have contributed to lasting memory issues, compounding the physical and emotional scars of his past. Each of these events, the painful end of the marriage that had defined his adult life, the complex dynamics of his extended family, and the dissolution of a significant later life partnership, served as another step in his journey away from the archetypal rock star. They reinforced his growing prioritization of privacy, family, and a search for personal authenticity over the demands and distractions of public life. As of 2026, Robert Plant, at 77 years of age, leads a life that is the antithesis of the golden god persona that once defined him. He makes his home in the serene and unassuming English countryside, residing in the area around Shatterford and Bewdley in Worcestershire. Not far from the Black Country where his journey began, his choice to live in this quiet corner of England is deeply symbolic of his overall journey. A full-circle return to his roots and a conscious embrace of a peaceful, grounded existence. Despite possessing a personal fortune, estimated to be around $200 million, his lifestyle is marked by a deliberate and cherished simplicity. He is a known figure in his local community, often seen in local pubs and shops, and is deeply involved in local affairs, most notably as a vice president of his beloved Wolverhampton Wanderers football club. He has by no means abandoned music, but his relationship with it has been profoundly transformed. He continues to write, record, and perform, most recently with his project Saving Grace, featuring vocalist Susie Deanne. This band explores a subtle and atmospheric blend of folk, American spirituals, and blues, a far cry from the stadium-shaking bombast of Led Zeppelin. His voice, once a symbol of rock and roll excess, is now a more nuanced and textured instrument, conveying the wisdom and sorrow of a life fully lived. Music is no longer a vehicle for fame or conquest. It is his primary outlet for processing the past and exploring new artistic territory on his own terms. As evidenced by his continued output, including a new album planned for 2025. The lessons forged in the crucible of tragedy are evident in the man he is today. The relentless series of losses, the near-death experience in Greece, the agonizing death of his young son, the sudden loss of his best friend, and the slow erosion of his marriage did not ultimately break him. Instead, these events reshaped him from the inside out. He has often spoken of how the tragedies forced him to pull his family tight together, and how, while the pain of losing Carrick never disappears, he has learned to cherish the memory of the joy his son brought into the world. The arrogant, swaggering frontman has been wholly replaced by a thoughtful, humble, and deeply introspective man who consistently chooses authenticity over adulation. Ultimately, Robert Plant's story is one of the most compelling in modern music, not just for the heights he reached, but for the depths he survived. His legacy is twofold. There is the monumental, untouchable legacy of Led Zeppelin, a band whose music continues to generate millions of dollars annually and influence artists across the globe. But there is also a second, more personal legacy, one of profound resilience and quiet dignity. His consistent refusal to partake in lucrative Led Zeppelin reunion tours is not a business decision, but a personal one. It is the ultimate testament to his transformation. A choice to honor the past and the friends he lost, rather than attempting to recapture a moment in time that is forever gone. He lives a life not defined by the glory he achieved, but by the losses he endured, proving that personal peace can be a far greater prize than public adoration, and that the deepest sorrows often leave a more indelible mark than the most spectacular successes.